Well, thank you all for coming. I'm amazed and thrilled that we have such a big audience. Thank you for coming. We're going to talk about Sean's book, Bob Honey, Who Just Do Stuff, or you say it the way Bob would say it.
Bob Honey, Who Just Do Stuff.
When Ted asked me to do this, he sent me the book, and I read it. The first time I said, "But I don't understand a thing." And then I read it the second time, and I felt I really got it. And it's an incredibly interesting book. It's something of a conundrum, but it's well worth getting deeply into. So Sean is going to read, for those of you who have not read it yet, or at least read too much of it, Sean's going to read a little bit. And then we're going to have a conversation.
Okay. So I typically read aloud with a little imbibement, which I don't have. So forgive me if I stutter a little. This is just because Jane considered that many people wouldn't have had a chance to read it yet. This gives maybe a little introductory sense of the book. This is from Station 2, or Chapter 2, Recollections of a Teenage Carny. It is the autumn of the age of reason. Meet Bob Honey, resident of 1528 Sweet Dog Lane, a man who most often speaks of himself in the third person, a former fixed-wing shuttle operator, barge fireworks display purveyor, and one who made a killing in the septic tank pumping industry by focusing on the exclusive clientele of Jehovah's Witnesses. After a brief monopoly on mail-order merkins and managerial stints at the Airborne Ordnance Maintenance Company and the Western Test Range, Bob regretted never attaining a real estate license and thereby never using his imagined tagline, "Buy a honey of a property." He thought it might even make a good t-shirt slogan, dressed over his honey bear heft, had his commitment to pocket protectors not overcomplicated the cut. Now in his mid-50s, Bob is a solitary man, if not a solid citizen, a stolid one. Although he lives alone, it is Bob's perception that he wakes to his ex-wife and their speechless marriage each morning. Every night, he goes to bed alone, quoting ABC, CBA, ABC, CBA, the alphabet's first three, forward, back, repeat, in lieu of sheep. This is typically followed by a dreamless sleep. Come morning, as always, there she still seems to be. His silent ex-wife, her chub and red hair, a small booger flopping, flittering, and fluttering like a carburetor valve backward and forward in her nostril with every breath in and out. A woman so cynical she doesn't understand the meaning of her favorite songs. One who concentered candy smells to her crevices in the self-objectification seeking of every random man's desire. This pursuit outweighed even her own existence in any actual elation that life might otherwise offer. It is impossible for Bob, waking up all these mornings to her speechless misandry and fraudulently feminist superhero dreams. Impossible for him not to consider ligature strangulation. Droplets of gasoline ignited one by one, the stink of her burning flesh and affirmations of anguished screams. And it gets funnier from there.
I'm going to read another paragraph because I want to talk about Bob's childhood because Bob clearly had a very traumatic childhood. And so I'm going to read a little bit of that. Out at the I-5 junction was an old mobile home park where Bobby, 11-year-old, learned to smoke ovals on the porch of the tipsy trailer where the teenage black chick lived with the cowboy. Though small for his age, B11, was thought a suburban danger boy and had trouble making friends in his own age group. Cowboy was often an hour or more late leaving the trailer. He and his juvie Jemima had a real line-in to do to keep that damn trailer level on its gravel pad. As Cowboy'd finally appear, it was an appearance sweaty and ready to take the dutiful neighborhood boy on his septic tank pumping runs. He'd teach that little chump the tricks of the trade. So I guess my first, Sean has been interviewed a lot, and I hate to have him answer the same questions over and over again, but I have to. So what motivated you to write this book?
I think there's, aside from probably always telling myself that I was lazy if I didn't write a novel, because I always had wanted to, I think, there was a kind of cumulative weight that I was feeling even from some of the best experiences that I'd had in film, because I was kind of, you have to so embrace the collaborative work in film, and that becomes your greatest strength when you're at strength in film, is that's what you embrace, is the collaboration. But more and more, it was kind of something in me was having to work harder to play well with others. Mm-hmm. And I think that what happens is that over time, you tell yourself, sometimes it's so, because there's so much that comes out of collaborative creativity that is so filling. But over a period of time, your own voice, I think, becomes a little more selfish. And at some point, you want to just do it and then see if it's shareable. And that was the idea.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. My experience, the thing I love about writing novels is that it's private. You do it in your own room. You're by yourself. You can say whatever you want. And then it gets out into the world and you go, uh-oh. I can't believe I said that. But you so enjoyed saying it, so why not,
Yeah, and I also got to a point where I so can believe I said this. and I think that's one of the other things is it's you can either be over-celebrated or over-criticized for film, because there are so many. But this is exactly the book that I intended to write, mm-hmm. Very deliberate. And so it's really only for those who choose to read it and then end up being glad they did. And I can't decide who that is, but I'm real happy.
Well, my experience in looking at the book on Amazon reviews is that 25% are really glad they did.
That's close. That's a better ratio than I get in terms of people meeting me.
But, I mean, you've written screenplays. So what, and I understand that screenplays are collaborative, but what made you feel that you had more freedom with regard to this book than, say, when you're writing a screenplay?
Well, I think part of it, certainly it can be, and I've seen it done, where screenwriters have written really just in prose and not stopped their flow to say, interior New York office day or whatever it is that you're breaking it down. But I think that because when I've written screenplays, it's almost always been for myself to direct. I've always been very conscious of how I had to sort of use those screen directions to explain to whoever I was going to ask to risk the money on it. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, I think that you can't help but become aware of the way you maybe self-censor your imagination, because if I go to this, well, that's going to be a $25 million shooting day, and so I'm not going to do that. And with this, I just got to flow. And also, as you were saying in the beginning, the privacy of it, it becomes a less private enterprise once you could have all the creative control in the world on a film, but eventually you're balancing other egos and other inputs, and it's really a director's job finally is balancing all of that. And with this, there was no pressure. I didn't have to wear anybody else's clothes in the morning to do it. And I could work, the kind of hours I wanted to work, where so often on movie sets, somebody's telling me that the day seemed short at 17 hours and I want to keep going.
Oh, wow.
And here I could keep going. And if I then slept a little bit to make up for it, I could do that too. It was the privacy, the total freedom of it was really preferable.
So was your writing day sort of, was it disciplined, sort of like Anthony Trollope, or was it more impulsive so that you would write a lot and then leave it alone, then write a lot, then leave it alone? Or were you more like a person who writes every day a certain period of time? Or
I would normally start as soon as I'd had coffee and a cigarette. And then it would work out that I would work about, well, first I wrote the first draft of it in about 30 days, but that was sort of typically expecting it to be shareable by osmosis. And so then I spent about 2 years going back and rewriting and clarifying things, but not where I had set a schedule, just that the day would go by and I would have worked a lot.
So did your editor help you shape it? I've had every kind of editorial experience. I've had the editorial experience where the editor corrected some spelling, and I've had the editorial experience where the editor and I were at loggerheads about things, and then everything in between. So was your editor sort of in there with you?
No, and it was it's my first experience with that, and I was very grateful for the way that the editor worked with me. I think that he understood very quickly when he read what I initially delivered him, that it was it was going to be my particular beast, and he was respectful of that. And I think what he would really do most often is say, I don't know what this means, and make a column note of what he really didn't know what it meant. And I really wanted somebody who I felt understood the book in the first place to understand it, so that I knew that there was an available understanding of it. Maybe not for everyone, but certainly that which I was putting down was being made clear. So he helped me get things clear, and very encouraging and supportive, and never balked at things that, the more I used to watch surgery channels and laugh a lot. And I laughed a lot while I was writing this book. And the more I laughed, the more I thought that idea was going to be balked at by the editor. But in fact, he normally said, yeah, that seems fine.
That's interesting, because my experience is, and you said this in your interview with Andrew O'Hare, that your kids will sometimes say to you, you expect me to laugh at that? And so I think it's great to find an editor who shares your sense of humor.
Yeah.
I remember when I was writing Moo, which was supposedly my funny novel, I would laugh, and I'd take it out, and I'd read it to the kids, and they'd look at me and go, huh.
Yeah.
But that's the comic novel. You do it for yourself.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily expect it to be well received, because there are a lot of people who won't understand it at all. And a lot of people, from my experience, a lot of people think, well, this is flat. And a lot of people think, oh, this is way too racy. So your own sense of humor is much more idiosyncratic than, let's say, your sense of tragedy or your sense of sadness.
I think that's true.
And so I think it's very brave to write a comic novel the first time out.
Well, I mean, my standard line on this is like, I'm 57 and my pool is heated, so it's...
About that Andrew O'Hare interview, you also said that you dictated a lot of it to someone who took it down, and some of it you wrote out longhand.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you felt a difference between those two methods of speaking it and writing it.
No, I'd gotten, once it was, let's say, more difficult to find the ribbons that my typewriter had, and I never made the transition to the laptop. Then I had many experiences of writing in dictating during the day. My assistant Sato, who's here somewhere, we've worked together since a long time ago, that becomes a collaboration in the following way: is as I would roll, like when I was writing a screenplay, I was so happy to be able, because her fingers move very quick on this stuff, and I could let my fingers never moved as quickly as my thoughts, whatever they be. And when I would dictate, it was so much more. I could think six places ahead and not lose the thought. And then when there was something, because she'd come to know what I was intending when I was writing so well, that usually the way that I would know something was not working is she'd be at it, and I'd say something, and fingers would stop, and she'd kind of. You're right. I don't want to do that. Back up and then go like that.
That's interesting, because when I write, I write every day, and then the next day I read it to my husband, and the moment where he either goes or gives me this look like, what in the world are you talking about? That's where I know that I have to fix something. So I can really appreciate that part of it. So in a lot of ways, it's a comic novel. And I'm curious what comic novels, or what novels in general, you've enjoyed in the past, or what you grew up reading, or...
Well, I've been a binge reader all my life as a reader, I suppose. I can go, well, not, let's say in my adult years, I wouldn't go years without reading. But certainly when I was younger, I would have periods of a year of reading everything I could get my hands on, and then 2 years would go by and I wouldn't read a book. And then when I got into my 20s, I started reading a lot of fiction, and poetry. I was interested in and I was writing poetry. But then in the last, let's say, 20 years, I became much more of a nonfiction reader. The writers of trying to, there were some. I remember Bukowski's Women as being very, very funny, very tragic and funny. That was a book that really stuck out to me in that way. I liked Harry Crews a lot, which was not so much comic novels, but kind of tall tale telling, and creating a world that was not perhaps so real, but felt it, and was a lot of fun. But I really got to, like I say, the last couple of decades worth, I'll probably read 2 novels a year, and the rest of it becomes nonfiction. It's just kind of the way that I leaned.
So do you remember anything from school that really struck you, or were you not much of a reader in school?
Yeah, I remember I went right down here at Santa Monica High School, and I remember reading the period of reading the existentialists that initially you're forced to do, and then became very fascinating to me. I remember a book by, there was a book, The Monkey Wrench Gang, that was a big one for me.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it's Abby, I think. And yeah, but my retention still and then was never very good. I really have more impressions of the books that I loved. The one case where that wasn't so was John Krakauer's Into the Wild, which I had read twice the night that I bought it, and then tried to get the rights to make a movie out of it. And when that wasn't going to happen, I didn't read it again for 10 years. And when it then did happen, I wrote the screenplay without having to read the book again.
Wow, that's really something. Yeah, I love the way that books enter your mind. We read David Copperfield in 8th grade, and I can still picture what I thought David was doing when he was walking to the walking away from his bad family into the countryside. And I love the way those images stick in your mind. That's what books do. So let's talk a little bit about Bob. Is there any hope here?
That's an interesting question. I think it's when you can laugh, there's hope. This is a book that, as much as anything, was me as a father of kids that are going to see the much longer run than I'm going to see, saying I really want to write into all of that which seems to be mine and the country's shared collapse of mental health, and that increases with any attention that we pay to the very thing that we have to pay attention to, which is the state of the world, the state of dignity, the state of compassion, the state of advertising, and how so much of the mainstream news that we see here is compartmentalized to the totally monocultural sensationalist stories because they're in competition with each other, and that's too often what we, the audience, seeks out in it. And I thought that I would take that part of the real world that I didn't want to deny, and let myself also laugh with it. And so this character Bob came first out of a kind of music in my head, and following that rhythm, starting with the title, which seemed just a ludicrous title, which was just what I liked about it. And then once there became a kind of, what's been interesting about having written the book is it seems like I sometimes have to explain to people that the novel is not necessarily an opinion piece, but rather a kind of like in acting where the music of a character comes to you, you follow that rhythm, and it has its own perceptions. And I wasn't laughing because I thought I was so funny when I was writing this. I mean, I think I'm pretty funny, but but because these characters, and principally too, the author itself is a character in this, because there's this idea I had of what that rhythm was, and it would be surprising to me because it wasn't an opinion piece, because it was a character that I might have improvised in the same way that I did as a writer, telling the story of Bob, and then there was Bob himself. And so the next thing was to get on the ride and see what came out on the other end.
Yeah, I felt that energy as I was reading it. The other thing I thought about it is that there so many things. It was very concentrated. It was like drinking something that with lots and lots of flavors that it all concentrated down, and you wanted to go slowly so that you could understand word by word, but you wanted to go fast so you could understand the plot. And so there's this constant tension between trying to understand the language, which is quite complex, and trying to understand the plot, which is sort of dripped in bit by bit. Right. And the plot itself is interesting. And so I think that poses a challenge But I think if the reader is patient and keeps going, then it sort of pops open, and you see how it all fits together. I'm going to read another little passage that really struck me. This is toward the end. It says, really, wonders Bob, as a mind that had managed thought at the silent circumlocution of sentences suddenly sharpens. Not charismatic enough for you folks? Too shrill? Too hawkish? Isn't it true that you never wanted qualifications? You wanted a star. You wanted to be charmed, seduced, and entertained. Was she the worst possible candidate, or are you the most arrogant, ill, and unqualified electorate in the history of the Western world? And what does it matter now? And I thought that really boiled it down. And the greatest thing about a novel is that the reader is reading the novel, and suddenly the reader and the writer, in the reader's mind, just click, and the reader thinks, oh, I understand this, oh, I understand this, oh, I understand this. This is really moving me. This is really changing me. And then you look around and you say, wait, we're still living in that same world that we were living in when I started this book? But there's always hope, I guess. What else did I want to ask you? So this one, I guess the passage I read shows that it's political.
Well, fictionally so, yes.
But all not. But well, now that reminds me of a question I wanted to ask. So Bob is obviously not you, because he and you have had completely different lives. So what was it about Bob and his life that just kept you intrigued and made you want to explore him?
Well, it sort of began as there was. You find sometimes I found myself choosing to follow through on that which set me afoot, and other times it was simply to set me afoot so that I would make adjustments in why I had set afoot in terms of the narrative and also the character. And with Bob, one of the initial ideas was that there was a kind of, I remember when I first saw Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List, and there was this incredible quality, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and it was as though morality was a thing lost to amnesia. It wasn't a proactive evil. It was something absent. Mm-hmm. And there, in the trauma of the very, very funny trauma of Bob, I had been working originally on this idea of a kind of amnesia to those things that had injured him. And so much of his life, where it had to do with a background in physics, engineering, all of these things he had the resulting knowledge of it, but you never knew where any of it came from. I backtracked on a little bit of that because it became interesting to me to get a little bit of that past. But to find out what things in a life make us either forget or renegotiate the narrative of our life as we remember it. And then when you have this world that we talk about being so seemingly hopeless in so many ways, how the intersection of the world's trauma with his, bringing him back out in a way, bringing his humanity back alive in the end. And because we're in a room of other people, it does occur to me that on the hope part of it, it's not only in humor that I find hope. I realize the timing of this, where I remember even thinking about the discussions about when Bob Dylan went electric. Things get out of hand in ways that, some generations are not going to accept it and others will take on the new. I am equally repulsed by technology as I see how much of it is going to be the hope of the future. I don't want much part in it, but then when I see out of the blue the basic change, it's not that I'm going to take on all of the positions of, but when you see those kids coming out from that incredible trauma in Parkland, and then immediately being able to articulate something that is not just a kind of poisonous vitriol against those who perhaps this ludicrous NRA represents, but that there is a kind of inclusionary tone to their articulation of it, that where you think to yourself, if people like this get together with people like this about other issues, and bit by bit it becomes something that isn't perishable because the commercials don't want to talk about that subject anymore. Mm-hmm. You cover all the bases with these other groups. It may be that there is hope. But I was trying to write the more hopeless a world could be written about, that's why it's funny. If I was going to write something that's not funny, I would certainly write a lot more hope into it.
I do think we need to stop and take questions. I think that's a good last line for this. Could you repeat that?
No. I told you I have this retention issue.
So many of you submitted questions via email. I will ask them, and Jane gets to ask follow-up questions. It's LA, so we'll start with the adaptation question. Any thoughts on the adaptation of Bob Honey into a movie? Would you consider directing it? Is there anyone you have in mind who would be good to play Bob Honey?
Yeah. The problem with adapting, I wouldn't have known the answer to this question until very, very recently, because I might have thought that if I ever wrote a book, that it might be something I'd want to make into a movie or otherwise participate. I think that because I kind of want to keep writing this character, and I think that a movie has its own indelible qualities, and that I think I'd lose track of the voice of my own. I would, if a very talented director had an interest in making it, they could, I'd be thrilled to spend just those 2 hours one time seeing it, but that's about it.
Sort of a follow-up to that is, having directed and acted in many movies, did the craft of acting or directing inform you in any way as you created Bob Honey?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's always been this conversation in talks about film where, people will talk about the actor who becomes a director, perhaps, if nothing else, knowing how to communicate with his actors because he or she has been an actor-actress. And I never really found a lot of common ground by having been an actor in directing other actors. I found much more common ground when I wrote the screenplay or adapted the screenplay from having lived through every moment of those characters and the challenges of what would be the scenes as a writer. And out of that, I could pass on maybe something to help support an actor in the choices they were making. But I find that it's that this is that writing is very like acting to me. You're hearing, you're embodying, you're feeling the thoughts and the feelings of the characters as you go, and it's only better because there's no one there to judge it, and I'm at that time of life where I'm very happy not to have anyone else's opinion until I'm finished.
Well, that might answer the next question, but feel free to expand on it. How do you handle criticism?
Well, that's a good question. I realize how much more painful it is to handle the criticism of a film than it is, in something like this, because when you make a film, especially if you're the director, and therefore you've asked so much of so many people that contribute to it, and you have the burden of money that's reliant on you on such a high level, and all of that stuff, that even if you would defend it, even if you believe strongly in something that you did, if it's not getting well received or it's being mocked, or it's very, you see all of the faces of those people that got up every morning and worked their ass off and were away from their families, working on every different job. In this one, I virtually anticipated every possibility of criticism or praise. I think that I was free associating all of it, and I just know that I wrote it, like I said earlier. When you feel like I wrote exactly the book that I wanted to write. It's exactly the book that I would want to read, and so the criticism is only here to get in the way of somebody else who may enjoy it, making a judgment. And the social media thing on fiction, I want to include in this answer in case I don't get the chance, that and I'm really grateful that Jane Smiley is talking to me about my book. She's a great writer.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
But there's a thing in the book, actually, where Bob considers the possibility that everybody else is wrong. And I am infinitely capable of considering that.
Well, that shows true sophistication. One of the things I love to do is resurrect old books that nobody liked when they first came out, like The Moonflower Vine, which nobody here has heard of, I'm sure. And The Man Who Loved Children, which is a book by an Australian author that's the most horrifyingly cruel book you could ever imagine. And yet they pop up, and for just a moment, people say, wow, that's really good. And then they go away again. And I think that's the greatest thing about books. As long as they exist in that physical object, some reader can come along and say, this really means something to me. It really touches me. It really says something to me. And my experience of this book is that it says something about the world that we live in that nobody else has said. And that's not to say I've read every book, but there's just something in the way that your opinions are expressed and your thoughts are expressed and Bob's life is expressed that just hits it right on the button.
Thanks.
So, more questions?
Yeah, next question. Why did you decide to use a pseudonym when you first published the audiobook when it first came out?
Yeah. There was this thing, and the flowery word muse, the kind of voice that you're hearing that's telling the story, which may or may not be attached to the writer. I decided to go ahead and give it a name, and then figured I'd go out there under the name of what's now a character in the novel, in part because it was just a way to kind of let that character be that character on its own for a while. I think that if I was, lying to you, I'd say that I, knew that it was going to evolve into something that I would have put my name on. I'm very aware of, and it's part of what the book talks about in some ways, is a kind of limiting culture where the baggage that someone who has had a public life on any level has, and the way that there are certain pettinesses that can be drawn up in people in their consideration of that piece when they relate it to something that they do or don't like about something else that you've done. And I just wanted to kind of let it breathe a little, and what it became by accident was a kind of workshopping of the book, which I've seen be a very valuable thing in filmmaking, and haven't done enough of it myself. But I remember this movie that I thought was one of the best movies of the last 10 years, this movie, Beasts of the Southern Wild. And that had been a workshop piece, and so I sort of accidentally workshopped it and did it initially as Pappy Pariah.
Next question, what's the role of an artist in activism and trying to implement social justice?
You know, what's the role of a human being when you wake up in the morning and you're drawn to do this or do that or care about this or care about that, and sometimes it's framed in a profession, and if you're lucky, it's a profession that you know, you're fortunate enough to have some freedom in. But I just finally, you know, when I die, I'd like it all to be blending and not know when I was acting in a movie or fixing a sink.
But I want to add something to that, and that is that every novel has to be political, because every protagonist lives inside a society. And so the more that you portray the society, the more that you, the author, have to have a theory about how the society works. And so whatever happens to the character constitutes your theory about how society works, and that has to be political. And so it's no surprise to me that this is a political book. The ones that aren't political, they are, but you have to find it underneath, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I used to use that as a kind of guiding principle in thinking about what our responsibility was just in working in film. There was a doctoral quote that said that the artist's responsibility is to know the times within which he or she lives. Mm-hmm. And I think that's essentially the same thing you're saying here.
Could you tell us about your friendship with Bukowski? And we're wondering if he had any influence in your transition into now a novelist.
It's very difficult to sort of quantify in influence. Certainly, he was among those that got me excited about writing. And my relationship started with him on the telephone from my retention on restaurants. What's the famous old place on Hollywood Boulevard that's Musso and Frank? So back in the days when there was the dial phone on the back wall, I was waiting for a call from him because I'd gotten in touch through his publisher. And he called, the phone rang, and I got on the phone with him. And he said, is this Sean Penn? I said, yes. He says, you're my last favorite actor. And to this day, I don't know if that means I was his least or he just was tired of having any more. And that led eventually to a long friendship and stories that I love to share with friends. And he was, I was a lucky camper to know him.
What is the best thing about being your age right now, and why?
Well, look, the worst thing about being my age is the age within which we live. It's alternately infuriating and heartbreaking to have to assume that we were all part of the problem that got us here. And so the hardest thing is the reevaluation of that. And the best thing is, you know, when you realize that you're all right, and you know, you get better at caring about the people you care about, and you have a lot less phantom worries, and boy, you have a lot more real ones. But there's something to do with the real ones. There's nothing to do with the phantoms, and they held me back for a long time.
Okay, another question. Gentleman says, although I have little doubt about your viewpoint on organized religion, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on spirituality. And by spirituality, I mean ethical values and practices aimed at increasing the quality consciousness.
Well, I'm not going to get into give a long answer and try to be philosophical. I will say that, you know, what the spirit is to anybody is, you know, that which keeps us curious and kind. The organized religion part of it is something that I would like to have a very productive way of calling bullshit on. But it's very difficult when you know very intelligent and very good people who are very committed to these organized religions. What I'll tell you by way of confession is that I was thinking when this new pope was brought in, oh shit, I thought we were finally going to have less and less Catholic recruiting, and now they got a rock star. And I wish he'd just minded his business in a way, because you know, I can see why he's so likable and seems so progressive, but it's continued validation of something that's just killing people, and has kept killing people, and it makes me angry. So.
A couple more questions, Sean. Greatest life lesson, and who gave it to you?
I just my father was an endlessly good and gentle person, and I remember coming home having seen a movie that the world loved. And I hated it. I just hated it.
Tell us what it was.
I was so angry that this movie was being so embraced, and I just went on and on. And he says, well, everybody has their own truth, kid. And that's a good one to remind oneself of. Oh, no.
Oh, come on. We really want to know.
Nah, really nice people can make really bad movies. Yeah. No, there's more important things to call bullshit on than one movie that I thought was a piece of shit.
All right, Sean, final question for the evening. 5 people, dead or alive, if you could have to dinner, who would they be?
Ava Gardner times 5? Thank you. Thank you.